coast of the continent of Asia. No concept, no consciousness, no definition distinguished West from East until 3,000 years ago the Greek spirit emerged. End of quote. Raising the issue of Greek philosophy, right, also provokes questions about the universal culture, and we have had a lot of talk about that already, right, this morning. Raising the issue of Greek philosophy also provokes questions about universal culture, about the dominant culture. Lately, by the way, you know, I mean, for a while now, when I read some mainstream books, I'm starting to get very annoyed. And the reason I get annoyed is because the fundamental orientation is European. So if there's a crisis of the world, it's a European crisis, or in other words, a European crisis is a world crisis. You know, and the fundamental orientation, you know, right, is Europe. In other words, nobody else matters, right? Everybody else is nothing but purely meaningless epiphenomena. All right? So, whenever that matters to people. All right? These come down to us through the voices of Western history as the source and origin of much that is regarded as progress in the Western world, philosophy, science, democracy, and name a few. Right? And if history itself is a Greek word, and we can think about that, and even history in some sense turns out to be the history of the West, a history of the world as determined by the West. When we talk about the ancient and modern world, we're talking about a Western European sense of things, and modernity has a specific meaning connected with certain material developments in Europe and so on. More specifically, when we raise the question of modernity, not only are we talking about European society at a particular time, right, and certain developments in European self-understanding, certain technical development, but also the relationship of the rest of the world to Europe. All right? And here one may be reminded of Hegel and his philosophy of history. Western Europe is the center, the universal center, right, with every other culture subordinate to it. On the other hand, to raise the issue of Africana thought, of Africana philosophy, is to raise a question about a certain perspective of Western civilization and modern Western culture and modernity. Right? Lewis Gordon, in his important book, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, provides a useful way of characterizing Africana philosophy. He says, quote, Africana philosophy is a species of Africana thought which involves theoretical questions raised by critical engagement with ideas in Africana cultures and their hybrid, mixed, or pre-allied forms worldwide. Since there was no reason for the people of the African continent to have considered themselves African until that identity was imposed upon them through conquest and colonization in the modern era, right, from the 16th century onward, this area of thought also refers to the unique set of questions raised by the emergence of Africans and their diaspora, here designated by the term Africana. Such concerns, right, include the convergence of most Africans with the racial term black and its many connotations. Africana philosophy, right, refers to the philosophical dimensions of this area of thought. It's also to raise questions about a subordinated group, an oppressed group, right, a group dominated by European modernity. It is a look at modernity from the perspective of those left out of its history, those for whom its benefits were never specifically intended nor readily conferred. It is also to raise a question of quite recent origins. Right? The notion of Africana philosophy is of course quite recent. When I was in graduate school, there were no courses of Africana philosophy, right? African American philosophy or Afro-Caribbean philosophy. One of the distinctions, by the way, of Howard University in about 1999, I held the first conference in Afro-Caribbean philosophy right here at Howard University, right? I'm proud to say one of the people who kind of brought it into existence, right? So we now have that. There was just philosophy. And even today, by the way, there's still very few courses in Africana philosophy in most departments of philosophy. And here I want to brag, all right? Howard University Department of Philosophy is the only department of philosophy, as far as I know, by the way, where one can study African American philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, Africana thought in depth. right? Most other places, you have to do it in an Africana Studies department or Black Studies department. But here, you can do it in any department of philosophy, right? As a matter of fact, by the way, as a matter of fact, if you want to major in philosophy, you have to, one of the required courses, right, is a history of Africana thought. Right, it's required here, right? So I'm very proud of that. How does universality of modern culture look to those who remain on this periphery, to those who occupy its underside, its underbelly? How does modernity look to those whose enslavement and brutalization was part of the rise of the modern world? One may derive a better understanding of the issue by briefly looking at certain scholars who have framed the issue of modernity and also framed it vis-a-vis those who are being considered outside of the West. Let's listen to Lucius Outlaw. Right? I'm gonna have a couple long quotes here, by the way, one by Lucius Outlaw, all right? I love the brother, all right? But his language is rough, all right? And also Frank Kirkland, right? His language is what it was, you know, so deal with it. He says, Africana philosophy is a name for an emergent and still developing field of ideas and idea spaces, intellectual endeavors, discourses, and discursive networks within and beyond academic philosophy, and was recognized as such by national and international organizations of professional philosophers, including the American Philosophical Association, starting in the 1980s. Thus, the name does not refer to a particular philosophy, philosophical system, method, or tradition. Rather, Africana philosophy is a third-order metaphilosophical umbrella concept used to bring organizing oversight to various efforts of philosophizing. That is, activities of reflective, critical thinking, articulation, and aesthetic expression, engaged in by persons and peoples, African and African descended, who were and are indigenous residents of continental Africa and residents of the many African diasporas worldwide. In all cases, the point of much of the philosophizing has been to confer meaningful orderings on individual and shared living and on natural and social worlds, while resolving the current emergent and radically disruptive challenges to existence so as to survive, endure, and flourish across successive generations. The brother is verbose. But by the way, isn't this rather interesting? Right? I mean, in many ways, you know, in white spaces, you don't need all this complicated locutions in order to say what you're doing. Right? So let's say with regard to something like Africana philosophy, you know, especially when you want to put it, right, in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? By the way, which is where it occurs, all right? So this means that you have to, you know, it has to be doctored up, you know, and made well complicated or something like that. All right. And let's listen also, you know, to my friend Patrick Henry, right? Who wrote, by the way, you know, the first critical text in African philosophy is called Caliban's Reason, Introducing Epicurean Philosophy. All right. Quote: from the point of view of the creative or world-constituted self, the culture of a people may be defined as the expression of a distinct consciousness of existence articulated in a variety of discourses. And philosophy is often the discourse, right, in which we get the most general formulation of that consciousness, right, of existence. And for Afro-Caribbeans, a corresponding view of our culture and philosophy would be formulated as a consciousness of existence as being the racialization and colonization of Africans and a way of life within the framework of the Euro-Caribbean plantation societies. Now, this brief survey, as we said, right, confirms that in any understanding of Africana philosophy and thought, a place of privilege is given to the ways of life and socio-political status of a particular people, and those people are understood to be, in some sense, oppressed, and their life and their way of life denigrated. The way of life provides a necessary lens through which they look at the dominant and universal culture and gain some measure of visibility. And this means, at a minimum, that they do not find a particular way of life reflected in the dominant perspective, the universal perspective, which is the only valid one. That is the most salient feature of the above views, right? They do not question philosophy as such, right, and seem to accept it to be an understanding, right, of the discipline. They, in a sense, right, only want to color it, so to speak, to make it speak in the language of color, to make it speak color-wise. They accept not only discipline in its current iteration, right? They accept this modern modality, right? In a sense, they are completely modern philosophers, right? There is another thinker that I skipped, right? Frank Kirkland, all right? Who wrote a very important essay, right, called Modernism in Black, all right? I'm not going to read these. So he's also very difficult, and his language is extremely cumbersome because he's also Hegelian. That's a little difficult. By the way, it's kind of rather interesting, you know. Kirkland and I went to the same school, New School. You know, when we were going to school, by the way, there were only two of us. To this day, they mix us up. How one scholar, Thomas Shelby, in a book called We Who Are Dark, characterizes African American philosophy as applying, quote, applying the traditional analytical and critical tools of philosophy to the central problems within black political thought, right? With the appropriate changes can be applied in a way to all versions, all current versions, right, of African philosophy. You know, have you done it, you know? All right. To put together the two parts of my topic, right, then raises the question of how to put together civilization and violence, lofty ideals and brutal treatment of whole groups of people, right? And the study of Greek philosophy in context can be very instructive for, as is well known, along with Greek philosophy and democracy, went Greek slavery. All right? In the mainstream discipline of philosophy, by the way, people who study Aristotle do not want to talk about slavery in Aristotle. They also don't want to talk about slavery in the Republic of Plato, right? And they don't want to talk about slavery in other dialogues. There's a famous dialogue, by the way, I don't know if you know, it's a famous dialogue called the Meno. All right, and Mina's a very bad guy. You know, he's asking, you know, well, how do you apply virtue? All right, and at one particular point, you know, Socrates engages Meno's slave in a discussion of geometry. Can you imagine that? If you're a damn slave, right, and you're compelled to answer questions about the angles of a triangle. All right. And it's interesting, by the way, because most scholars then, you know, ignore that. They don't think about it, right? You know, but anybody can do this stuff. It doesn't really matter, you know. As a matter of fact, by the way, you know, I found out, by the way, that one of my articles that I submitted to a prestigious journal, you know, a mainstream journal, was rejected, by the way, because I mentioned African American. It was a good article on Aristotle, probably, but because I mentioned African American, it was turned down. You know? How do those who occupy subordinate positions on the source of the world order, that devalues them, how do people who are regarded as outside of history, or whose ancestors were thought not to be a part of history, relate to the only group of people to make history? A group which regards its own development as the very essence of both progress and culture, yet regards some as invisible. The other part of my paper, which I'm only going to summarize, right, is Greek philosophy, right? And I make it very brief. It has two fundamental phases. The first, by the way, and here there's a great deal of controversy, right? The first phase is what I call the emergence of philosophy or the discovery of philosophy, and there can be quite a bit of controversy here, by the way, as to whether philosophy sprung out of the Greek mind in the same way that Athena came out of the head of Zeus. All right? I do not believe that at all in that sense. All right? But there's a lot of controversy here about the origin, right? But in any case, by the way, you know, the story that we have, right, is that it emerged, right, with the thematization of nature, right, something called nature, all right? So the first philosophers then were the first people who started asking about the universe, asking about the sun, asking about the moon, asking about plants, and talking about the nature of things, all right? The second fundamental phase, right, was initiated by Socrates, all right? And it represents, right, in my opinion, what I call the self-consciousness of philosophy. And what that means is this. It means that Socrates, who is normally regarded as the discoverer of political philosophy, he recognized that your views of the universe is always politically mediated. All right? So in other words, the first philosophers, try to go about looking at things without recognizing how their perspective, how their political perspective, or what you may call nowadays a cultural perspective, colors things. That's what I call it, the self-consciousness of philosophy in that particular sense. All right? So these are regarded, by the way, the two fundamental phases, right? That gets, the second phase, by the way, gets perfected in Plato and Aristotle, and the familiar divisions that these guys created, including rhetoric that we've heard a lot about today. All right? The significance, by the way, the significance for me of recognizing the second movement of Greek philosophy. 3 minutes, all right. The second phase, right, is a recognition, by the way, how one's cultural or political perspective colors how you look at the universe. All right, and therefore this raises, by the way, some important questions for African philosophy. All right. No, I'm gonna end them, by the way. I'm not gonna get to slides, but I'm gonna end in this way. Going back to my topic. For me, the notion of Africana philosophy, or putting the Africana before philosophy, right, is non-problematic. It is problematic, by the way, in mainstream philosophy. All right? So for me, that's fine. But I wish to suggest another way of understanding it. It seems to me that we should not be so quick to accept the current understanding of philosophy and its modern modernity. Right? It's important for us as African American philosophers, Africana thinkers, to be able to go back all the way to the beginning. You can't begin with modernity. You can't begin with the 16th, 17th century. Right? You got to go back and do some of the original work, right, in investigating things in the first place. Right? Is philosophy nothing but a series of tools, whether analytical or critical or not? By accepting the tools, right, have we not also already accepted the form of the objects on which those tools can and will be used? Let me suggest another way to keep the Africana, but not trapped by the current understanding. If reason looks different depending on its particular dress, on its particular clothing, on its laws, on its architectural garb, and if reason is always embedded, right, what the Greeks call nomos, right, law, nomos embedded and never appears naked, so to speak, then Africana philosophy calls attention to the particular political experience of a particular people compels us to separate reason from its political architecture of any group whatsoever. Okay? No one particular group of people, no one legal or lawful constellation or cultural constellation is the natural home of reason. Right? And that has been the myth that we perpetrated for a very long time, right? That the very elements of reason, right, are constituted out of the particulars of white culture. Right? That must be changed. Right? We could say that there is a fundamental, let's say, direction, right, between human reason, right, and the way in which it is, so to speak, or come to light in particular people. Let me stop here. Thank you.
That's right.
You're not? I can go. I can go. That's fine. Yeah. Are you sure?
Okay, up next, we have Professor Earl Etienne.
Good afternoon, ladies and gents. You guys don't seem excited to hear from me today. I know you have quite a bit of work to deliver as a result of these presentations. So if you're excited, it's going to make it easier. My name is Earl and I'm actually from the College of Pharmacy. I handle clinical and administrative pharmacy. I teach administration and policy. So one might ask, why are you talking at a rhetoric discussion? We happen to believe, based on our immersion doing work in Africa, that rhetoric really impacts health in a major way. And if we don't understand the tenets of rhetoric, we are likely to make poor policy or poor decisions in terms of healthcare delivery. I have a very unorthodox style in terms of development, at least I think so, at least I was told so over the years, in that people who work with me have to be prepared at all times. I was a Boy Scout, and as such, if you're a PhD student working with me, you have to be prepared. So my work is grounded with the work of the students. And in a few short hours ago, I let my graduate student know that she will be delivering this lecture instead of me. So without further ado, I'm going to present to you Dr. Adaku Ofebu. Adaku is coming to us. She did a Doctor of Pharmacy degree in the College of Pharmacy, and then decided that she was so excited she wanted to pursue a PhD in pharmacy administration and pharmaceutical sciences. So Adaku, you have the stage, and please do not disappoint.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edson. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so just like Dr. Etienne mentioned, we've been doing work in African countries, predominantly in Ghana, and we've been looking at primarily diabetes, but we've also noticed while we've been there that there has been an increased prevalence of opioid abuse in Ghana, and we've realized from doing some research that there's other countries that are having similar challenges, and since we are also doing research about the opioid crisis in America, we wanted to kind of explore how rhetoric impacts the opioid crisis in Africa. Okay, so what we're going to do is first of all define rhetoric. I know we've talked about rhetoric all day, but we just want to just kind of hone in into afternoon, so we just want to go back to, what is rhetoric and how does it impact public health crises? And then we want to talk about the opioid crisis briefly on the African continent, and then recommendations on the use of rhetoric to improve treatment outcomes in Africa. So, just to start out, rhetoric is basically the art of effective or persuasive speech or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. So basically, just thinking about coining a term or coining a phrase or kind of branding something, like that kind of rhetoric can impact how people perceive things, right? So, in essence, depending on how you shape the rhetoric behind something, it's going to affect the actions that people take in relation to that rhetoric, and then that's going to therefore impact the outcome. So it's just thinking about whatever you say can impact what you do, and then whatever you do is going to impact what happens, right? So if you think about, there was a crack epidemic in the U.S. at one point, and there was also a heroin epidemic in the past. And during that time, when Nixon was president in 1971, when there was a public health crisis in relation to drug abuse, he decided to declare a war on drugs. And he said that drug abuse was public enemy number one. And then in the Reagan era, I know we're all not from that time, but Reagan was president in 1980, and their idea was, in relation to drugs, just say no. That was the idea. So because it was perceived as you're using drugs because you have a moral failing, right? Then the idea is you should be punished if you use drugs. So what does that mean? We're going to criminalize drugs, and then we're going to incarcerate you. So the rhetoric of treating it as public enemy number one, and it's a war. When you think of war, you think people should be punished. And that's how we ended up going from a war on drugs to mass incarceration. Okay? So then we're looking at, in terms of today, we're looking at the same issue of the opioid epidemic as a public health emergency. So when you're thinking about health and you're thinking about an emergency, now we're looking at addiction as a disease. And when you think of a disease, you think of treatment. So we have medication-assisted treatment, we think about rehabilitation, and we think about it with compassion because the person has disease, which means they need treatment and they need help. So just thinking about how the rhetoric from before was very, punitive, like we're going to punish you, you need to go to jail. And now today, we're looking at it as disease and you need help. Just the rhetoric affected how people decided to approach managing people who had these conditions. So you see it's the same issue, but just the rhetoric changed how people approached it. So with the whole idea of before, you have the moral failure, you have punitive interventions, and then you have the mass incarceration, which led to family disillusion, basically. Families were getting broken up, and people were dying because they were not receiving the treatment that they actually needed. So, and then within that, what we're seeing from, we're kind of bridging from what happened before until now, the opioid crisis that we have now kind of stems from actually something that happened in 1980. There was a letter that was written in the New England Journal of Medicine by authors Porter and Jay. And they basically said addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. They just happened to have some patients in a hospital that they noticed, they didn't seem to have an addiction problem, so they wrote a letter saying it's not addictive, in short. And then the Joint Commission, which is an organization that helps with the accreditation of hospitals, said that pain should be considered the 5th vital sign. And if you think of vital signs, you think of like your heartbeat, are you breathing? Things of that nature are very critical to a person's survival. So if you have pain as a 5th vital sign, you're going to take that very seriously. So it caused people to really, like medical providers, to really pay more attention to patients' pain. So they asked them, are you in pain? If the people were in pain, they would give them opioids because that was something that was readily available to help manage that pain because they didn't want a vital sign to be neglected, right? So what happens, the action, you end up having overprescription of opioid analgesics. And then that was a contributing factor, not the only factor, but it was a contributing factor to the opioid epidemic that we have today. So the rhetoric of it's a 5th vital sign, it's a rare, it's not addictive. Now we have this issue of people overusing them, and now we have the opioid epidemic we have today. So now addiction is disease, we use medical interventions, we have rehabilitation, we have treatment. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, in regards to the opioid crisis on the African continent, we've been seeing a rise in the non-medical use of tramadol. Now, I know tramadol is available here. It's considered a narcotic. On the African continent, it's cheap and it's readily available. So there's been people who've been using tramadol. Some people claim that it kind of helps them if they're working for long hours. It kind of helps them stay focused. So people have been using it for that purpose, but then in the process of using it, they end up becoming addicted to it. There's also been a rise in the use of codeine-containing products such as cough syrup that has codeine in it. And there's also a drug called niobe, which is a combination of cannabis, heroin, and antiretroviral drugs that people have been using, like more so in South Africa. So these are the opioids that are kind of being used on the continent. This is not the only thing, it's just some examples of opioids that are being used on the continent right now. And the response from African countries so far has also been a law enforcement thing, like they've been trying to criminalize the use of opioids in that way. There have been policies that have been put in place by the World Health Organization to try to address mental health because substance use is a mental health issue, so they've been trying to incorporate strategies to help address that. There have been legislative actions to create national policy. I know Ghana and Kenya have definitely made policies, and other countries have made policies as well. And the African Union created the African Medicines Agency as a regulatory body to help address drug-related issues. So there's been definitely a response from African countries in regards to this. So for our recommendations on the use of rhetoric to improve treatment outcomes in Africa, we wanted to say that to use the use of rhetoric that demonstrates the multifactorial and complex ecology of health by healthcare providers. So what that means is you don't just look at addiction as you're using something because you're bad, in short. There's so many things you have to take into account. It's not about, since you're using this, you have to take some medication and you'll stop being addicted. there's so many things to take into account. What about the person's well-being? Like, if the person has